Servus everyone and welcome back to a new video. This is an AMD K6-2 CPU rated at 300 MHz with a core voltage of 2.2. This CPU will replace the Pentium 200 that I have used in most of my previous videos. I want to see what performance increase one would get by upgrading the system with this processor. But before we get into the details, I want to quickly go over an outline that I have made in the very first video of this series. Most of the topics have been covered. There is a video about the history of the motherboard, we have tested functionality, and installed some higher capacity memory and a level 2 cache module. We also installed Windows 98, enabled USB support, and replaced the Dallas module due to a drained battery. This video tackles another point on this list, using the AMD K6-2. For this CPU we have to use the P55T2P4 in revision 3.1 because it supports two separate voltages. The AMD CPU requires 2.2 volts for the CPU core, while the I/O remains at 3.3 volts. In a previous video we have already looked at undocumented settings for configuring lower voltages that are neither mentioned on the board nor in the manual. Apart from the voltage, we also need to configure the external clock and the clock multiplier. The details of the configuration is printed on the board. Revision 3.1 not only has support for dual voltages, but it also supports higher external clocks. Officially, the board supports an additional setting of 75 MHz. But again, there are undocumented settings that allow for 68, 83 and even 108 MHz. I will add the different configurations in a diagram at the end of the video. The Pentium 200 is a single voltage CPU that could be configured with an external clock of 66 MHz and a multiplier of 3. That is the maximum configuration that can be achieved using the board in revision 2.3. In newer revisions, we could push the CPU a bit higher by utilizing the additional external clocks. I would be careful with old hardware and not push it to its limits. A slight overclock of up to 10% should be possible, however. And yes, I know, increasing the frequency by 8 MHz seems to be quite pointless compared to modern CPUs. Now if we move on to the AMD K6-2, it seems to be quite difficult to find a good setting. We have to keep in mind that this CPU from AMD was released about 2 years after the P55T2P4 hit the market. To make new processors run at their advertised speeds, they used an offset for some of the configured multipliers on the board. Specific models of the AMD K6-2 increased a configured multiplier of 1.5 to 3.5 and 2 to 6. But even then, only two undesirable settings could be used. One with a low external clock of 50 MHz and one with a very high external clock of 83 MHz, none of which seem to be ideal. In a future video, we will short two pins on the CPU which will allow us to run the CPU with a lot more configurations. When the so-called BF2 pin is shorted, the CPU will increase the configured multiplier by 2. With this modification in place, we will be able to achieve much better configuration options. The ones I'm mainly interested in are the ones with a stock external clock of 66 MHz or more. At the moment, we have no other choice but to use the motherboard without the modification. I have benchmarked some of the configurations to see how different settings affect the overall performance of the system. For the Pentium, I used the P55T2P4 in revision 2.3, while for the AMD K6-2, revision 3.1 was used. I used the same memory modules with a total of 32 MB as main memory. As graphics adapter, I have used the Trident 9440, which may not have been an optimal choice because it only has 1 MB of video memory, but nevertheless, let's have a look at some of the results. The blue bars represent the Intel Pentium 200, while the green bars represent the AMD K6-2. You can also see the multiplier, the external bus speed, and the total CPU frequency. The letter S represents stock memory settings, while the T indicates tuned memory timings. All test results are represented in relation to the Intel Pentium 200 at stock memory settings. In CPU-C, the AMD CPU clocked at 200 MHz is about 28% faster than the Pentium 200 at the same clock speed. Higher clocks result in better performance, except in the case when we configure the AMD CPU with 50 MHz external bus speed. Memory timings do not affect the results. The FPU performance scales with the CPU frequency. At the same clock speed, AMD is about 8% faster than Intel. Again, memory timings do not affect the results. SpeedSys favors the AMD CPU, which is about 54% faster than the Intel CPU. The performance scales with the frequency, and memory timings do not affect the results. In Unreal, the AMD CPU is about 15% faster than the Intel CPU. And here we can see the first time that the tuned memory settings have an effect on the results. The external clock speed influences the overall performance of the system. At comparable CPU frequencies, the CPU with a higher external clock usually is more performant than the other. In this benchmark, the AMD clocked at 300 MHz with an external bus speed of 50 has an identical performance of the same CPU clocked at 233 MHz and an external bus speed of 66. Topbench is another benchmark that shows how significant the external clock speed is for the overall system performance. The effect is so great that the AMD K6-2 clocked at 300 MHz is 35% slower than the Pentium 200. This makes the AMD CPU clocked at 300 MHz the slowest CPU in this benchmark. Memory timings do not affect the results. Doom takes advantage of multiple variables: the external clock speed, the CPU frequency, and the memory timings. The AMD processor is about the same speed as the Intel at the same clock frequency. However, if you're upgrading to an AMD K6-2 and clock it at 300 MHz with an external clock speed of 50, you actually get a performance regression. It would be better to stick to your Intel CPU. Next up is Chris's 3D bench. And we have a very similar picture we have seen before. And the same goes for the PC Player benchmark. Although the AMD CPU is faster than the Intel when clocked at the same speed, if you're increasing the clock speed to 300, you're not gaining any performance improvements. In Quake, the Intel CPU beats the AMD at the same clock speed. However, again, the external clock speed, tuned memory timings, and a high CPU frequency are key to a well-performing system. By now it should be clear that we should avoid the external frequency of 50 MHz. The conclusion of these benchmarks is to optimize your memory timings. Avoid going below the stock frequency of 66 MHz for the external clock, and try to reach a CPU frequency that is close to the rated speed of your processor. The next 3 slides show the level 1 cache performance. The level 1 cache operates at the CPU frequency. The higher the CPU is clocked, the higher the performance of the level 1 cache. The level 2 cache, however, operates at the speed of the external bus frequency. Therefore, the lower the frequency, the less performant the level 2 cache. I think it is clear by now that the external clock speed should not be lowered to achieve the rated speed of the processor. In the next section you will see how I configured the memory. The timings you will achieve will depend on the quality of your memory modules, but you can use those settings as a guideline. And as promised, at the end of the video, I will show the configuration for the external clock speed. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit the like button, and I will see you in the next one.